And then I'm also going to have Phil, my colleague from MIT, doing some of the presenting with me. So as I go through the first slides, Phil from MIT will just give an overview of a short, sort of an introduction of what we're doing. Hold on, why can't I go forward? There we go. All right, so I'm going to go over Phil's going to go over MIT's methodology, and then I'm going to quickly go over the cyber innovation ecosystems, Global Epic, who we are, the results of our work with MIT, and talk about some of our next steps and conclusions. So Phil, why don't I let you take it away on these next 3 slides?
Sure, and I should be very briefly, Katie. Thank you very much. So last year, MIT with HebrewU, INCD, and DCMS hosted an event at MIT to think through cybersecurity, and particularly to apply a methodology that we have at MIT, which looks at innovation ecosystems. One tries to answer the question, why is the world not flat? Why do we Europeans do great research, but the Americans seem to do extremely well on the other side of the valley of death? And so we come at this with considerable humility with you cyber experts. It's a long time since I got to work with the likes of Chris on some of the subjects. 20 years ago, talking about things like Huawei, well, whatever happened to them. And it's amazing that some of the issues that we talked about back then are still present today. So I'm coming at this as an innovation ecosystem person, and I'm delighted that Katie will then present what she and her colleagues at Global Epic have done with that. So we look at innovation around the world. We've been teaching this for about 8 years and running a global program. And basically, we've boiled it down very simply to 2 key elements, stakeholders and the system. So on the left is our triangle showing the system, which helps us explain why some places the entrepreneurs do well, and in other places innovation is not as successful. We've applied this to 50 regions around the world through our REAP program. And for those of you of an academic bent or who can't sleep at night, there is a link to the fuller paper about how to assess ecosystems. On this slide, however, I really want to point you to our 5 stakeholder model on the right. There was a long time we talked about government and corporate, public and private, military industrial complex. In the late 20th century, academics added the entrepreneurial university, and we ended up with the so-called triple helix, that all you needed was government, university, and corporates. And this may have been true for a while, but it no longer captures the full truth. So for MIT, we think there are 2 other key stakeholders to understand innovation, and that is the entrepreneur and risk capital, not just VC, but the full spectrum of venture funding. This helps us explain why America does so well at this, while Europeans and some of our North Asian friends sometimes have problems getting our brilliant ideas, which are no less as good as the Americans. We just don't seem to commercialize them. So those are our 5 stakeholders. And Katie, if you can take me to the next slide, I'm going to double click on that system part, because one of the key insights for me coming into this as a diplomat and government worker was how MIT separates out an innovation capacity from an entrepreneurial capacity. And there's a variety of inputs on either side. Human capital is clearly important, as the economics profession tells us, as is funding, all the way down to culture. So I won't dig into that now, but it is the approach that we take to innovation ecosystems, because you have some that are very good at innovation capacity and spend lots of money on research and science, and yet somehow fail to get the entrepreneurial results. And one of the reasons we think we can explain the great success of the United States, but also Israel as startup nation, and particularly in cybersecurity, is it has a blend not just of great scientists, but of great entrepreneurs, and that they come together and make a difference. And we've attempted to capture some of that in the web app on the right. So with that, Katie, if you can go to the next slide. So we had this event last year, and as our summary at the bottom, web linked there, basically came up with, the point relevant for today is that we think this innovation ecosystem approach may be relevant to the world of cybersecurity. And I'm heartened by what Tim and Ken and Chris have said, that this seems to be the case. We don't have the answers on cybersecurity. We're at the start of this research, but we're very heartened to hear that even in the world of cybersecurity, where you think the world would be flat because anybody could do digital anywhere, that's not the case. So we are delighted to partner with Katie as president of Global Epic, and I shall return it to her so she can see what she's done with this particular approach.
Great, thank you, Phil. So as was said earlier by the presenters, we know that there's this cross-sectional world between economic development and cybersecurity. That's not really up for debate. My career is in economic development, and I clearly understand 23 years in that if we don't have a secure environment, we're not going to be able to trust in the economy that we're building. So that's the premise we're beginning with here. So Global Ethic was found in 2017 by leaders in Israel, UK, US, Canada. Both Ronnie and Godfrey are on our conference today, and they're two of the original founders of Global Ethic. The mission was about creating local value, but through a global community. And we really do this through sharing transparent and comprehensive data among all of our ecosystems. We share methodologies for how we do this, but most importantly, and I think Chris and others said this previous, is that we built a community. And we found that it's the human element of building a community that really helps us spread best practices, spread methodologies, and build a stronger global cyber community. So these are our members. We represent 30 different members across 22 countries. These members, you know, there's probably a whole white paper just in how they came about, but it was really relationship based. We met each other at conferences. A lot of us were just like-minded people, and Global Epic is an ad hoc organization. There's no membership fee. We have no budget. We don't have formal incorporation. I'm a volunteer. All of us are volunteers. And we get a lot done considering we have zero budget and we're all doing this on sweat equity and trust. It's pretty impressive. So this is just a breakdown of some of the data around, I track the data of our 30 members. And so you can see some of this. We've got, you know, roughly half and half are regional ecosystems versus a national ecosystem. And I should just pause and say, when I say ecosystem, and I'm looking at this data, I'm talking about, and this will get to fiscal agent, which is the next one. If you think about where Phil had his star, and we also have a similar star of an ecosystem, in the center of our ecosystem is the organization that gets up every day and thinks about how to keep this cybersecurity ecosystem organized. And there's people who are paid to do it and supported by it. And so every single one of our members is represented by an official organized organization. Like, for instance, Ken in Japan, it's JCIC is our member. So every single ecosystem has a center. And if you don't have an organizing center that pulls in academia, industry, and government, then you are generally not a member of Global Epic. And we don't extend an invitation. We will work with you on how to get there, but all of our members represent that. You can see about 13 of our programs do have a startup program within them, supporting that innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem that Bill talked about. The maturity, some, you know, about half are 2015 or earlier, but 8 of them just came online in the last 2 years. So speaks to someone's point. I think Chris said this is early days. This is the first inning of a 9-inning game, as our governor likes to say about cybersecurity, and that's reflected there. International corporate business partners, we go after this as a measure of how sophisticated the ecosystem is with its expertise to draw in international companies. And then funding source is different than fiscal agent. So fiscal agent is, this is where my checks come from, but funding source is where does the money for those checks come from. So you could have, you know, only 5 of the organizations are paid for by a government entity, but 16 of them, the money comes from government, but it may actually be a nonprofit, an industry membership association, or an academic organization, and that's an interesting thing to look at. International conferences, this is how a lot of us met each other. And so about half of our members do have an English language international conference that markets globally for people to attend it. And then less than half of our members report formal G2G agreements around cybersecurity, which is interesting. I'm not going to go through all of these, but as we talked about, this is about a digital economy. And so our members report that these are technology thrust areas that they're focused on as economic clusters, that they recognize cybersecurity is going to be critical to in order to scale in these areas. And so this is a great map of relationships across the digital economy and our members. And so what we did is when we started working with MIT, MIT had identified several indexes that were used to measure innovation and entrepreneurship. And I thought, well, what if we added a few additional indexes to then measure for cybersecurity? And could we evaluate the Global EPIC membership for its strength as an innovation, entrepreneurship, and cyber ecosystems? So that's what we did. I added the CIPRI data around GDP on military spending. We added the Global Cybersecurity Index, and we added UNESCO R&D professionals and percent population. This becomes very interesting for Israel because Israel actually is #1 in the world in this data point. And among our Global EPIC members, in CIPRI data, they're #5 in the world, but #1 among Global EPIC members is Israel. And you think about the investment Israel has made through its military, into its human capital and cybersecurity. This is very telling about the strength of Israel in cybersecurity. So as we go through this, the results basically came out this way. On the far left, you have countries that end up ranking very high in top 5 and top 10 in these indexes. And then on the other side, you have countries that don't rank in the top 20, but probably not even in the top 100. You have countries these are all members, by the way, of Global EPIC. Taiwan is a very interesting outlier, as many of you know, because Taiwan is actually a very strong member of Global EPIC, but they are generally not ranked outside of China. And so if they were, I would expect them to actually be much closer over on this side. So this was an interesting way for us to just look at our own membership and where are they? And it allows us to have conversations with them around, well, you know, maybe you're really strong in something here, but not strong in something else. And how can we share our own practices to make sure that everyone's headed in this direction? Now, I should also say we discovered through doing this that some countries, and Israel's included, don't report this data into some of these indexes. So this is hardly perfect. This was a way for us to get a snapshot. And a snapshot's a great way for us to then take next steps to dig deeper, right? So the other interesting thing we found out is who we're missing. This was really interesting. So like I said, we formed Global EPIC on trust and sweat equity. But after looking at this, I then looked at all of the countries in the top 20 across all these indexes. And I was able to look at who do we not have in Global EPIC, who we should. So it was interesting. South Korea came up at the top. South Korea is a great example. This was interesting because we've met them at conferences. In fact, Phil, when we did the OECD conference in London last year, they were there. And they said, we'd love to join Global EPIC. The challenge has been they don't have an organizing body that runs the ecosystem. So there's not a member. There's a collection of people who would like to be involved, but there's not an actual member organization that they've identified. So that's interesting. Germany, you know, it's great to hear from Germany this morning because my understanding is we had early days conversations with Germany. There's a lot of hubs in Germany, so of course it also matters who you talk to. Norway, of course, I think we're already having some initial conversations with them. Also interesting, Luxembourg was interesting for us. This was sort of on nobody's radar screen, who knew, but Luxembourg's a country that clearly we'd reach out to. And then to Germany's point about manufacturing, we've had conversations with Swissnex in Switzerland. They've talked about how strong they are in the autonomous and drone market, but not cybersecurity. And I said, well, if you're going to have a very strong economy in autonomous systems and drone technology and not pay any attention to cybersecurity, that's going to be a problem. And you might want to consider doing both. So certainly talk to the folks at Swissnex Boston near me. So we looked at all of this, and as I said, these are not perfect. These are a snapshot. But Ronnie Zahavi, who's on the call today, and Godfrey, our co-founders, thought, you know, I think there's a way for us to take all this information, and because of the importance of this, create an index around cybersecurity ecosystems that will allow us to just have these countries and regions and cities better measure themselves and understand their strategy and where they should start from. So we look at the KPIs that our members currently report on, which I track. And then Ronnie has actually built this great model around inputs. Well, we have stakeholders, which I said, government, industry, academia, inputs, which is really the flow of input and money, and then outputs, you get to human capital and startups, and then outcomes, what we largely want to get to is, like Chris talked about with his members as well, it's around, wealth creation in a cybersecure environment. So what we want to do is take this into an infographic model that looks very easy to see. And I want to point out here, you'll see that the Global EPIC member is always in the center of this. And we can't emphasize this enough. We just don't think this works without that really well-organized leader in the center that's pushing this. In our model, the person at the top of this image changes depending on who the Global EPIC member is. So if the member is an industry person, industry's at the top here. If it's government, government would go to the top. But the member is always the focal point in the center. So we go through and you have an example of then how would we show the linkages between them from high, medium, and low. This is based on data that's self-reported by our hubs. And then what allows us to do is look at what is the local strength in the solid line and how do you compare that to the global EPIC average across your peers in a very quick snapshot. And then ultimately you would have this really nice dynamic model, this dynamic model that we're in the process of building. This is early days. We're just drafting this and working with our members now. So this is an early stage project that we're really excited about, but it does allow us to compare this apples to apples reference. Obviously, comparing an entire country to a city is really complicated, or a small country to a big country is really complicated. And so this allows us to even out this indexes and start to help these countries build work plans. So our conclusions that these globally recognized indexes are a great roadmap to how you build a network of ecosystems, but it's a snapshot. And regardless, the human leadership, as we've all said in this, the relationships, the leadership in the center of this is critical to not only building, but sustaining these ecosystems and how we sustain this work moving forward. We have to invest in the leaders in the center and make sure that they feel supported and funded to do their work. Each ecosystem is built on local subject matter experts. This was said earlier. If we're working with Costa Rica. If there's no training programs in Costa Rica and no cyber expertise, it's going to be really hard for them to build an ecosystem around this. So certainly subject matter experts are critical. Have to make investments in human capital innovation, as we've said. Again, I said Israel's leadership in this is really interesting and shows how quite effective it is. This just massive investment in human capital and how this is translated in Israel into the powerhouse that they are. And then ultimately, I think we all have the goal of helping developing countries strategically benchmark their own growth so that every country in the world has an opportunity to have a safe cybersecure economy as they grow and mature into the digital economy. So with that, I'm all set. Yeah. Great.
Thank you very much, Katie. Thank you for the presentation. I also thank you, Phil, for doing the presentation together with Katie and emphasizing,